Peter Cetera refused to speak to them. After leaving, now we know why he was the golden voice of Chicago, the man who sang love into stadiums and turned a brass rock band into pop royalty. But in 1985, Peter Cetera walked away from it all. No farewell tour, no interviews, no looking back. And from that moment on, he never spoke to them again. Not during their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, not during reunion offers, not even when the cameras were rolling. Why? What could drive one man to turn his back on the band he helped build and stay silent for decades? Let's go back to where it began. Before the tuxedos, before the power ballads, before the falling out, there was a kid from the south side of Chicago with a battered bass guitar and a voice that didn't quite fit the times. Peter Cetera didn't start as a frontman. He wasn't even supposed to sing. In 1967, Cetera was recruited into a new experimental rock band called The Big Thing, later renamed Chicago Transit Authority. The group was a bold fusion: horns, jazz, politics, psychedelia. Cetera was their bassist, a quiet figure surrounded by louder personalities, both musically and emotionally. But everything changed in 1970 when the band released 25 or 6 to 4. Cetra's piercing tenor cut through the chaos of guitars and brass. Suddenly, he was the sound of Chicago. As the band evolved, so did their image. From politically charged suites to smooth love ballads, the transition was gradual but deliberate, and it was Cetera's voice leading the charge. But not everyone was comfortable with the shift. Some band members saw it as a betrayal of their original mission, a commercial softening for radio airplay. Cetera saw it differently, not a compromise, but an evolution. His songs were topping charts. If You Leave Me Now won a Grammy. For the first time, Chicago had a #1 hit. It should have been a victory. Instead, it lit a fuse. Unseen by the public, a line was being drawn inside the band. On one side, musicians who wanted to jam, experiment, and stay political. On the other, a vocalist who was becoming the face, the voice, and, increasingly, the target. The seeds of separation were sown not in anger, but in silence. By the late 1970s, Chicago was a supergroup. Billboard hits, stadium tours, platinum albums. But inside the machine, Peter Cetera was becoming both indispensable and isolated. As the band pushed into softer territory, Cetera emerged as the frontman, reluctantly at first, then unavoidably. Hard to say I'm sorry. You're the inspiration. Baby, what a big surprise. All Cetera, all hits. But with each success, resentment simmered. Band meetings grew tense. Arrangements were contested. Writing credits became battlegrounds. Cetera had gone from a bassist in the background to the centerpiece of a band that no longer recognized itself. To some, he was overshadowing the group. To others, he was the group. Still, he kept showing up. Studio sessions, endless touring, press obligations, and always the scrutiny. There were no solo demands, no press tantrums, no public feuds. But behind closed doors, Cetera was asking for something simple: a break. In 1984, he requested time off to pursue a solo album. Not to leave Chicago, just to try something else, explore other sounds, stretch a different muscle. The band gave him an answer that would change everything. No, they feared what it would mean, that he wouldn't come back, that his success would eclipse theirs, that without him, they might finally confront how fractured things had become. The denial wasn't just business, it was personal, and it left Cetera at a crossroads. The message was clear: stay in the band or walk away. He made his choice quietly. No press release, no farewell show, just one man stepping out of the spotlight he helped build. And when he left, no one followed. Peter Cetera's solo debut was everything his time in Chicago wasn't: free, personal, and unapologetically melodic. Glory of Love, his breakout hit from The Karate Kid Part 2, soared to #1. His voice was everywhere, and it wasn't just success, it was vindication. But back in Chicago, silence turned to bitterness. The band continued, replacing Cetera with new vocalists. They kept the name, the horn section, the touring machine. But the sound was different. The dynamic had shifted. In interviews, members avoided mentioning Cetera. When asked, they were curt, dismissive, even sarcastic. Cetera noticed. He never retaliated publicly, but in private, the lines were drawn. He didn't attend shows, didn't speak to his former bandmates. When his daughter was born, none of them reached out. The wounds were deeper than anyone guessed. Behind the scenes, old contracts were questioned, royalties disputed, who had rights to what. Cetera had sung the the songs, written many of them, but Chicago owned the brand. Lawyers were quietly activated. Conversations that once flowed through music now moved only through legal teams. The irony was cruel. The more successful Cetera became, the less he spoke. The louder his music got, the quieter the friendships grew. Chicago would later claim they tried to reach out, that he didn't respond, that the door was always open. But Peter Cetera, he never once looked back. Not for a tour, not for a reunion, not even for the night they were all meant to be celebrated. The Hall of Fame was waiting, and Cetera wouldn't come. In 1976, Chicago's If You Leave Me Now stunned even its creators. The lush ballad wasn't meant to be a hit. It was a late addition, tucked near the end of Chicago X, a moment of vulnerability in an otherwise brass-heavy album. But when it topped charts in the US and beyond, Columbia Records seized the moment. For the first time, the industry saw Chicago not as a jam band with horns, but as a soft rock powerhouse. And they had one man to thank: Peter Cetera. The song won Chicago their first and only Grammy. But what should have been a moment of collective triumph became a catalyst for division. Cetera had written the song alone, lyrics and all. His vocal performance, unmistakable and soaring, was credited for its emotional power. And yet, at the awards ceremony, no one from Chicago joined him on stage. In fact, no one from Chicago even showed up. That absence wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. And to Cetera, it stung. Backstage, whispers of ego swirled. Industry executives privately called Chicago Peter Cetera's band. Bandmates bristled. The group that once prided itself on democracy, where every member had a voice, was now orbiting a single star. Some saw Cetera's growing fame as a threat. Others simply felt left behind. The tension was no longer silent. It was structural. From that point forward, Cetera's songs were under closer scrutiny. He was given fewer writing credits. Internal votes clipped his contributions. Behind closed doors, there were jokes that Peter was off writing movie soundtracks, while the rest kept the band alive. Even though he remained committed to Chicago, rehearsing, recording, and touring non-stop, the air had changed. And Cetera? He started keeping a distance of his own. He stopped attending certain meetings, focused more on his solo ideas, said less, even when it hurt. Not because he didn't care, but because he was already preparing for what might come next. The Grammy, meant to honor a song, had exposed a fracture, not just between friends, but between visions. One was chasing legacy, the other, freedom. In 1985, after nearly 2 decades with Chicago, Peter Cetera left the band. The announcement, when it came, was eerily calm. No tabloid headlines, no finger-pointing, just a short, press-polished statement about creative differences and new directions. But inside the industry, it sent shockwaves. Cetera had been the band's voice on their biggest hits. For many fans, he was Chicago. His departure left a question hanging in the air. Could the band survive without him? And why, after all that success, had he left so quietly? The truth was more personal than professional. Behind the scenes, Cetera had asked for one simple change: more flexibility. He wanted to explore solo opportunities while remaining in Chicago, similar to what Phil Collins had done with Genesis. The band said no, flat out. They saw solo ambitions as betrayal. Side projects meant disloyalty. There was no compromise. Cetera, exhausted from years of friction, chose to walk. But unlike others who leave bands with dramatic farewell tours or emotional press conferences, he disappeared. No public rants, no studio exposes, just silence. He dove into solo work, recording Solitude Solitaire with a new clarity. His voice, no longer diluted by group politics, sounded sharper than ever. The album soared. Glory of Love became an international hit. And in an ironic twist, it became his Grammy moment, nominated for an Oscar, too. Cetera was doing just fine without Chicago. But Chicago wasn't. They brought in new singers, kept touring, released new music. But the sound had shifted. The energy was different. The chemistry, gone. In interviews, members danced around the subject of Cetera. When asked why he left, they gave practiced answers. Some blamed his ego, others hinted he wanted too much. But none of them could hide the wound. The band wasn't just minus a voice, it was minus a foundation. Cetera, he remained silent. Not once did he speak publicly about the hurt, about the resentment, about the bond that had quietly eroded over years of creative isolation. He didn't need to explain. The silence said everything. As years passed, fans clung to hope for a reunion. Chicago was still touring. Cetera was still performing. Surely the paths would cross again. Surely time would heal what ego had broken. But the phone never rang. Privately, Cetera waited. He wasn't opposed to a reunion, not entirely. But no one reached out. No sincere invitation. No apology. Just interviews where bandmates insisted, "The door's always open." A door, Cetera believed, they had long since locked from the inside. The tension lingered for decades. When Chicago was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2016, fans thought the silence might finally break. Cetera had been a major reason the band was even being honored. It was the perfect moment for reconciliation. Emails were exchanged. Briefly, terms were discussed. A tentative plan formed for him to perform "If You Leave Me Now" one last time. But disagreements flared over keys, arrangements, who would speak, who would play. Old grudges re-emerged in new forms. Cetera pulled out. The band performed without him. The silence continued. In later interviews, Cetera said he had no regrets, that some things, once broken, stay broken, that old friends can become strangers, and that music, while beautiful, can be a battlefield. He wasn't bitter, but he was done. Done chasing closure, done rewriting the past, done waiting for a call that never came. For the world, it was a missed opportunity. For Cetera, it was liberation. But still, one question haunted every fan. How could something so harmonious end in such silence? In the shadow of Cetera's departure, an invisible war unfolded, not on stage, but in boardrooms. While fans debated whether Chicago could survive without its voice, behind the scenes, lawyers dissected decades of contracts, royalties, and ownership. Peter Cetera had written and sung some of the band's biggest hits, songs still spinning on radios and filling arenas. But Chicago, as a corporate entity, held the rights. Their structure had always been complex, a shared partnership, but with clauses that favored group decisions over individual stakes. When Cetera left, those clauses turned from legalese into leverage. Soon, disputes arose. Royalties were delayed. Licensing deals became murky. Cetera's name was sometimes omitted from promotional material. On some greatest hits compilations, his contributions were trimmed or repackaged. For fans, it looked like a minor oversight, but to Cetera, it was erasure. He didn't take the fight public, but his legal team did. Letters were exchanged, agreements challenged. There were whispers of lawsuits, settled privately, quietly. The damage, however, was already done. What had once been artistic tension had calcified into mistrust. Inside the industry, stories circulated. Cetera had reportedly asked for proper credit on songs he'd written. Not more money, just recognition. In return, he was met with cold professionalism and, at times, indifference. It wasn't about ego, it was about memory. Music, after all, is legacy. And for Cetera, that legacy was becoming distorted. Meanwhile, Chicago pushed forward. New vocalists rotated in and out. The brand endured, but the sound kept changing. To the casual listener, the band had survived. But to longtime fans, the soul of Chicago, that unmistakable tenor, had vanished. For Cetera, it was never just about leaving the band. It was about how quickly the band tried to leave him. That was the final betrayal. Not the breakup, not the silence, but the slow erasure of everything he'd helped build. In 2016, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame finally came calling. After years of lobbying by fans and critics, Chicago was being honored. For many, it was a long overdue validation of a band that had shaped American rock. But for Peter Cetera, it was something else, a crossroads. Publicly, he expressed gratitude. Privately, he hesitated. The band reached out, tentatively. Emails, not phone calls. Proposals, not conversations. There was talk of him performing a single song, one last reunion, just a few minutes on stage. But even those negotiations crumbled over details. Keys, arrangements, guest musicians, decades of unresolved emotion resurfaced in passive-aggressive emails and third-party mediations. It wasn't just about music, it was about control. Cetera suggested performing his way. The band pushed back. Neither side would yield. And once again, the silence returned. When the night arrived, Peter Cetera was absent. Chicago performed without him. During their speech, his name was mentioned, briefly, politely. There was applause, but no warmth, no tribute, just an empty microphone where the voice of their greatest hits should have stood. Fans were stunned. The moment had been primed for reconciliation. A simple song could have healed decades. Instead, it widened the gap. Even Rolling Stone commented on the absence, calling it the elephant in the room. Cetera later explained, in a restrained statement, that it just didn't feel right. There was no anger in his words, just finality. He had been ready to return for one night. But when even that became a negotiation, he chose something else. Peace over performance. Dignity over nostalgia. And once again, Chicago and Peter Cetera went their separate ways. Over the years, whispers of a reunion never died. Promoters dangled millions. Documentary filmmakers plotted scripts. Fans flooded forums, begging for the original lineup to take the stage just once, just for closure. But it never happened. Cetera kept touring solo for a time, then retired quietly in 2019. No dramatic send-off, just a man stepping back from the spotlight, as he always had. In his final performances, he avoided Chicago's biggest hits, not out of bitterness, but out of respect. They belonged to a time that no longer did. The band, meanwhile, kept Chicago alive in name. New frontmen, new albums. But the ghost of Cetera's voice haunted every chorus. Fans noticed, critics noticed, even the band, at times, seemed to acknowledge the gap, not in words, but in the set lists that leaned heavily on the past. There were moments when the reunion almost happened, an acoustic charity show, a televised tribute. Talks would begin and quickly unravel. One side wanted authenticity, the other, control. The past proved too heavy to lift. In interviews, Cetera would smile when asked about Chicago. He'd say it was a different lifetime, that he wished them well, but the warmth never returned. Not truly, not deeply. Why didn't they ever reunite? Maybe the answer was simple. Because they never actually healed. The band moved on, Cetera moved away, and the dream of a final encore faded, not in flames, but in silence. Today, Peter Cetera lives quietly, far from stadium lights, far from lawsuits and interviews. He doesn't chase headlines, doesn't comment on the band's latest moves. His legacy lives in the songs, the ones everyone still sings, even if they don't remember who wrote them. Chicago, too, continues. They sell tickets, release albums. They are survivors of changing trends, shifting lineups, and one unresolved fracture. But behind the curtain, something remains unspoken. The story of Peter Cetera and Chicago isn't about one man leaving a band. It's about what happens when silence replaces truth, when respect curdles into rivalry, when the voice that defined an era refuses to return, not out of hatred, but out of heartbreak. There were no blow-ups, no betrayals captured on camera, just time, distance, and a deep refusal to forget how it felt to be unheard. And so the fans are left with fragments, songs that still resonate, videos that still play, but no closure, no harmony. Just echoes of a partnership that once touched millions and then collapsed without a word. Peter Cetera never spoke to them again. And now we finally understand why. Peter Cetera didn't leave Chicago in anger. He left in disappointment and stayed gone in silence. Now, after decades of mystery, we finally see the reasons why. Subscribe for more untold stories like this and tell us, was Peter right to walk away?